The rusted skeleton key felt unnervingly cold in my palm, a jagged piece of iron that represented every cent I had left in the world. As I looked at the sagging porch of the cottage, the realtor wouldn't even meet my eyes, her gaze fixed instead on the overgrown weeds as she muttered something about untapped potential. I didn't know then that the house wasn't just a ruin, it was a calculated piece of theater, a final, crushing gift from the man I had spent 12 years building a life with. It was only when I stepped over the threshold and felt the floorboards groan like a dying animal that I realized I hadn't bought a sanctuary, I had bought a crime scene, where my own future was the intended victim. To understand how I ended up standing in a clearing in the middle of the woods, clutching a key to a house that looked like it was being reclaimed by the earth, you have to understand the life I left behind. For over a decade, my world was defined by the smell of expensive sandalwood soap and the quiet hum of a high-end air filtration system. I lived in a glass and steel penthouse in the city with Mark, a man who moved through life with the effortless grace of someone who had never been told no. Our marriage was a series of carefully curated moments. Every Saturday morning, the sunlight would hit the marble countertops at exactly the right angle while Mark brewed pour-over coffee, the aroma of dark roast filling the air. He would lean against the island, his cashmere sweater soft against my skin as he hugged me, whispering about our future, our investments, and the legacy we were building. I was the creative one, a freelance landscape designer who saw beauty in the wild, while Mark was the architect of our stability, a financial advisor who treated our bank accounts like a grand, unfolding symphony. Then there was Eleanor, Mark's mother. She was a woman who smelled permanently of Chanel No. 5 and old money, her spine so straight it seemed physically impossible for her to ever relax. Eleanor didn't yell. She didn't have to. She used silence like a scalpel. She would visit our penthouse, run a gloved finger over a bookshelf, and offer a thin, tight smile that told me everything I needed to know about my rustic tastes. For years, I told myself her coldness was just a generational gap, a byproduct of a life lived in high society trenches. I tolerated the subtle jabs about my family's modest background because Mark would always take my hand under the table, his thumb tracing circles on my knuckles, in a silent promise of solidarity. Or so I thought. The asset that started the war wasn't the penthouse or the cars. It was the inheritance from my grandfather. He had been a simple man, a carpenter who lived in a small town, but he had invested every spare penny into land and blue-chip stocks. When he passed away 3 years ago, he left me a substantial sum, nearly $700,000, held in a private trust. I remember the day the papers arrived. Mark had been so supportive, his eyes misty, as he talked about how proud my grandfather would be. He suggested we keep it separate, for my own security, a gesture I found incredibly noble at the time. He even introduced me to a specialized lawyer to handle the trust, a man named Sterling, who had been a family friend of Eleanor's for decades. "It's about your independence, Julia," Mark had said, his voice thick with sincerity. "I want you to know that you're with me because you want to be, not because you need my bank account." That sentence became the foundation of my trust. I leaned into our life, pouring my own earnings into our shared expenses, while my grandfather's money sat in that protected trust, managed by Sterling, under the watchful, supposedly benevolent eye of my husband. We were the perfect couple. We traveled to Tuscany, we hosted charity galas, and we talked about having children once the timing was right. The first crack in the glass didn't come with a bang. It was the smell of a different perfume on Mark's collar. Not a cheap scent, but something floral and aggressive that definitely wasn't mine. Then came the late nights, the emergency client meetings, and the way his phone began to live face down on the nightstand. When I finally gathered the courage to ask him about it, expecting a denial or an explanation, the mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Mark didn't apologize. He didn't even look guilty. He sat across from me in our designer living room, sipping a vintage scotch, and told me he had outgrown our life. He said he needed someone who understood the pressures of his world, someone like his new associate, a woman whose father sat on the board of 3 major banks. The divorce was swift and surgical. Eleanor suddenly became my most frequent caller, her voice dripping with a newfound, terrifying sympathy. She told me she wanted to make sure I was taken care of, despite the tragedy of the situation. She and Mark insisted that since our marriage was ending, I should take my inheritance and find a place where I could heal, away from the city's prying eyes. "You've always loved the woods, Julia," Eleanor had purred during our final meeting in Sterling's mahogany-paneled office. "Mark feels so guilty about the penthouse, but legally, his firm owns the lease. However, we've found something special for you, a quiet retreat, a place where your grandfather's money can be put to good use, giving you the fresh start you deserve." I was reeling, my heart a jagged mess of grief and betrayal. I just wanted it to be over. I wanted to stop seeing Mark's cold, indifferent face and Eleanor's predatory smiles. Sterling presented the papers for the investment property, a cottage on 12 acres of prime woodland, 3 hours from the city. He explained that the trust would cover the purchase in full, leaving me with a small but manageable monthly stipend. "It's a steal, Julia," Sterling had assured me, his pen hovering over the signature line. "The land alone is worth triple the asking price. It's the ultimate security." I signed. I signed everything because I believed that even if Mark didn't love me anymore, he wouldn't actively try to destroy me. I believed that 12 years of shared breaths and whispered secrets meant I was safe from his cruelty. 2 weeks later, I drove my packed SUV down a gravel path that seemed to lead into the very heart of nowhere. The trees grew thick and dark, their branches clawing at the sky. When the GPS finally announced I had arrived, I stopped the car and stared. The cottage didn't look like the photos Sterling had shown me. In the brochure, it was a charming, weathered stone house with a slate roof and a wraparound porch. The reality was a nightmare of rotting timber and shattered windows. The roof had partially collapsed on one side, and the prime woodland was a swampy thicket of dead pines and invasive vines. I stepped out of the car, the humid air heavy with the scent of decay. My boots sank into the mud of the driveway. I walked toward the porch, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. This couldn't be it. There had to be a mistake. I reached the front door, the wood swollen and gray. I fumbled with the rusted key, the iron cold and unforgiving. It took 3 tries to get the lock to turn, and when it finally did, the sound was like a bone snapping. I pushed the door open, and the smell hit me, not just dust and damp, but something sharp, chemical, and wrong. I took a step inside, the floorboards screaming under my weight. My eyes adjusted to the gloom. The interior was stripped bare, no copper pipes, no wiring, just the skeletal remains of a house that had been gutted years ago. But that wasn't the shock. The shock was the pile of documents sitting on a lone, rusted metal folding chair in the center of the living room. I walked toward it, my legs feeling like lead. On top of the pile was a yellowed envelope with my name on it, written in Mark's precise, elegant handwriting. My hands shook so violently, I nearly dropped it. I tore it open, expecting a note of apology, perhaps a final explanation. Instead, I found a series of bank statements and a final closing disclosure. My breath hitched. The purchase price for this ruin wasn't the $200,000 Sterling had told me. According to these papers, the trust had paid $650,000 for this property, nearly every cent my grandfather had left me. But it was the name of the seller that made the world go black at the edges. The property hadn't been bought from a private estate. It had been sold to my trust by a holding company called EM Real Estate, E for Eleanor, M for Mark. They hadn't just moved me out of the way, they had sold me a piece of garbage and pocketed my entire inheritance to do it. I stood in the center of the rotting room, the silence of the woods pressing in on me, and realized I was standing inside the very money they had stolen from me. I looked down at the floorboards, and that's when I saw it. A loose plank near the chair, partially pried up, with something white and plastic peeking out from the darkness beneath. I knelt down, the grime of the floor staining my jeans, and pulled the plank away. My pulse thundered in my ears. Tucked into the crawlspace was a waterproof briefcase, heavy and cold. When I clicked the latches open, I didn't find money. I found a stack of ledgers and a series of encrypted hard drives, all labeled with the logo of Mark's financial firm. As I flipped open the first ledger, my eyes blurred. It wasn't just my money they were moving. My husband and his mother hadn't just betrayed me. They were using this run-down house as a dead drop for something much, much darker. I looked at the names in the ledger, names of city officials, judges, and developers, and I realized that the trap they had set for me had a hole in the bottom, and I had just fallen straight into their secret. The silence of the woods was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, like a thick blanket draped over a tomb. As I knelt on the grime-slicked floorboards, clutching the ledgers from the hidden briefcase, the early warning signs I had ignored over the last 6 months began to click into place like the tumblers of a safe. I realized now that the betrayal hadn't started with the divorce. It had been a slow, methodical harvest that I had been too blinded by love to see. 3 months before the split, Eleanor had invited me to a girls' lunch at her favorite private club. She had been unusually attentive, pressing her hand over mine, her eyes gleaming with a strange, predatory light. "Julia, dear," she had purred, "with the market being so volatile, Mark and I were discussing the diversification of your grandfather's trust. It's such a large sum to leave in stagnant stocks. Don't you think it's time we put it into something tangible? Something that moves?" I remember the way my stomach had given a tiny, nervous flip. "Mark handles the specifics, Eleanor. I trust him completely," I had replied, my voice light. "Of course you do," she'd whispered, and the smile that followed didn't reach her eyes. "But sometimes men get distracted. You need to ensure your own physical security." Mark mentioned a real estate venture, a way to clean up the portfolio, so to speak. "Clean up?" I'd asked, a forkful of salad halfway to my mouth. "Streamline," she corrected instantly, her tone sharpening. "Make it more efficient." Then there was Mark. In the final weeks, he had become a ghost in our own home. He would stand on the balcony of our penthouse, staring out at the city lights, his shoulders hunched as if he were carrying the weight of the skyline. When I would approach him, he'd flinch, his hand instinctively moving to cover his laptop screen. "Is everything okay, Mark?" I'd asked one night, resting my hand on his back. His muscles were like knotted iron. "Just work, Jules. Sterling is being a pain about the new acquisitions," he'd muttered, not looking at me. "Go to bed. I'll be in late." The smell of him had changed too. It wasn't just the other woman's perfume later on. It was the smell of cold sweat and metallic anxiety. He stopped calling me his North Star. He started calling me the beneficiary. I thought it was just the stress of the firm. I thought we were a team. I didn't realize I was the mark. The point of no return didn't happen when I signed the divorce papers. It happened right now, in this rotting living room, as I turned to page 42 of the first ledger. My heart didn't just race. It felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my chest. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps that tasted of mold and old paper. The ledger didn't just list my grandfather's money. It listed Property 7B, this very house, and the capital infusion associated with it. The dates matched the weeks before Mark asked for the divorce. My trust hadn't just bought this house. It had been used to launder nearly $4 million of untraceable consulting fees belonging to Mark's firm and Eleanor's private estate. The $650,000 of my inheritance was just the entry fee to grease the wheels. I flipped to the back of the ledger and found a folder of photocopied IDs. My blood turned to ice. There was a copy of my passport, my driver's license, and my signature, perfectly forged, on documents authorizing the transfer of funds to offshore accounts I had never heard of. The world began to tilt. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to lean my head against the damp stone of the fireplace. My hands were shaking so hard, the pages rattled like dry leaves. "No," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. "No, no, no." I wasn't just broke. I was the owner of a money laundering hub. If the authorities looked at this house, they wouldn't see a victim. They would see the mastermind. Mark and Eleanor hadn't just stolen my money, they had stolen my identity and used it as a human shield. You've always loved the woods, Julia. Eleanor's voice echoed in my mind, mocking and cold. I looked at the hard drives in the briefcase. My fingers brushed the cold plastic. Every emergency meeting, every stressful night Mark had complained about, it was all here. They had sent me here because they thought I was too broken to look. They thought I would sit in this ruin, cry over my lost life, and eventually the house would accidentally burn down or collapse, taking the evidence with it. I stood up, my knees buckling for a moment, before I forced them to lock. The quiet, healing retreat was a death trap. I looked at the rusted metal chair, the only furniture in the room, and I felt a sudden, piercing clarity. The grief that had been a heavy fog for months suddenly burned away, replaced by a white-hot, crystalline rage. My husband had sat across from me at breakfast, kissed my forehead, and then walked into an office to sign away my life. My mother-in-law had hugged me at my grandfather's funeral while calculating how to gut his legacy. I walked to the window, looking out at the dark, tangled woods. They thought I was a landscape designer who only knew how to make things pretty. They forgot that to build a garden, you first have to be willing to get your hands dirty and dig up the rot. I grabbed my phone, my thumb hovering over the contact for the local sheriff. But then I stopped. No. If Mark had city officials in his pocket, as the ledger suggested, I couldn't trust the phone. I needed a plan. I needed to be as cold and surgical as they were. I looked back at the briefcase. This wasn't just a ruin. This was my armory. I reached into the bag I'd brought from the car and pulled out my laptop. I didn't have internet out here, but I had the drives. As I began to plug the first one in, my hand stopped shaking. The physical shock was gone, replaced by a terrifying, hollow stillness. "Okay, Mark," I whispered into the empty, rotting room. "Let's see what you're really worth." Just as the drive hummed to life, a pair of headlights flickered through the trees, sweeping across the peeling wallpaper of the living room. Someone was coming. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that it wasn't the welcoming committee. The headlights cut through the gloom of the rotting living room like searchlights, illuminating the dancing dust motes and the peeling strips of wallpaper. I didn't move. I couldn't. I stood there, the ledger clutched to my chest, my knuckles white and aching. The car engine cut out, and for a moment, the silence of the woods returned, deeper and more predatory than before. Then came the sound of footsteps on the porch. The floorboards outside groaned, the same dying animal sound I'd heard earlier. The door, which I hadn't locked, creaked open. Eleanor stepped in first, her designer heels clicking sharply on the ruined wood, a grotesque contrast to the decay around her. She looked around with a slight, disgusted curl of her lip, her silk scarf fluttering in the damp draft. Behind her, lingering in the shadows of the doorway, was Mark. He looked smaller than I remembered, his expensive coat draped over his shoulders like a weight he couldn't quite carry. "It really is a dismal little place, isn't it?" Eleanor said, her voice smooth as cream and just as cold. She didn't look at the house, she looked directly at the ledger in my arms. I told Sterling the aesthetic was a bit much, but he insisted on authenticity. "You," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking, "you sold me this. You stole my grandfather's life for this?" I gestured wildly at the room, at the briefcase at my feet. "We didn't steal it, Julia. We repurposed it," Eleanor said, stepping closer. I instinctively recoiled, hitting the damp stone of the fireplace. "Think of it as a contribution to the family's longevity. You were always so proud of your modest roots. We just gave you back exactly what you came from." I looked past her to Mark. He was staring at his shoes, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Mark, say something. Tell me you didn't know. Tell me you didn't sign these." I held up the forged ID copies from the ledger. Mark finally looked up. His eyes were bloodshot, and he looked exhausted, but there was no apology in them. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his jaw working silently. He looked at Eleanor, then back at the floor. He didn't say a word. The silence wasn't a lack of sound, it was a physical weight, a suffocating vacuum that told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't a victim of his mother, he was her most loyal soldier. "He has nothing to say to you, dear," Eleanor snapped. "And frankly, you should be thanking us. You have your independence now, a 12-acre estate all to yourself. I found the hard drives, Eleanor, I said, my voice gaining a terrifying, jagged edge of strength. I found the names, the judges, the developers, the consulting fees. This isn't just a house, it's a dead drop for a laundering ring, and you put my name on the title, you put my name on the accounts. Eleanor laughed, a sharp tittering sound that set my teeth on edge. Of course we did. If the ship ever sinks, Julia, you're the one at the helm. But don't worry, we've already taken precautions. We've filed a report with the city regarding your mental instability following the divorce. If you go to the police with stories of secret ledgers in a ruined house, they'll just see a grieving, broken woman trying to lash out at the family that tried to help her. The room seemed to spin. I felt a surge of nausea so potent I had to bite my tongue to keep from retching. My pulse was a frantic hammer in my ears. This was the first twist. They had preemptively branded me as insane to cover their tracks. But there's more, isn't there? I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. I looked at the ledger again. The monthly stipend, the one Sterling said was from the trust. It's not from the trust at all, is it? Eleanor's smile widened. It's a consulting fee from EM Real Estate, paid directly to you for land management. Every cent you spend on groceries or gas is technically a payout from the very funds you're so worried about. You're not just the owner, Julia. You're an active participant. You've been laundering for us for 3 weeks now. I felt the air leave my lungs. I was trapped in a cage they had built out of my own inheritance. Why? I choked out, looking at Mark. 12 years, Mark. I loved you. I supported you when your firm was struggling. I took care of your mother when she was sick. Why do this to me? Mark finally spoke, his voice a low, pathetic mumble. The firm wasn't just struggling, Julia. We were drowning. We needed a buffer, a clean name. You were the only one we could use. The only one who trusted you enough to be sacrificed, I spat. Enough of this melodrama, Eleanor interrupted, her tone turning businesslike. Give me the briefcase and the ledger, Julia. We'll leave you the house and we'll even increase your stipend. You can live out your days here, gardening and pretending you're a martyr. It's a generous offer considering the alternative. The alternative? I asked. The alternative is that we call the sheriff right now to report a trespasser in a property owned by a holding company you have no legal access to, Eleanor said, her eyes narrowing. And Mark? Well, Mark has other things to attend to, like the nursery he's building in the penthouse. The second twist hit me like a shard of glass to the heart. I looked at Mark, my eyes wide. A nursery? Mark didn't look up, but his silence was my answer. Becca is 5 months along, Eleanor said with a sickening pride. A boy, a real heir to the legacy you couldn't provide. So you see, we really don't have time for your little rebellion. The briefcase. Now. I looked at the two of them, the woman who had treated me like a cockroach for a decade, and the man who had let her. My hands stopped shaking. The heat in my chest didn't cool. It froze. It became something hard and sharp, something I could use. You're right, Eleanor, I said, my voice dropping to a calm, terrifying whisper. I am a landscape designer, and I know exactly what to do with a piece of land that's full of rot. I didn't hand her the ledger. Instead, I stepped back, my foot finding the loose plank I'd uncovered earlier. I kicked the briefcase deeper into the crawl space and stood my ground. You want this evidence? I asked. Come and get it. But remember, Eleanor, this house is mine. I signed the papers. I'm the owner, and in this county, we have very strict laws about intruders on private property. Mark finally looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden flickering fear. But Eleanor just took a step forward, her face contorted into a mask of pure aristocratic rage. You think you can play games with me, you little peasant? You have nothing. You are nothing. I have the ledger, I said, a cold smile finally touching my lips. And I have the hard drives. And most importantly, I have 12 years of knowing exactly how you hide your tracks. You taught me well, Eleanor. Now get out of my house before I show you how much I've learned. The sound of their car tires spitting gravel as they sped away was the sweetest music I'd heard in months. I stood in the doorway of my rotting house, the ledger still clutched to my chest, and felt the shift. It was like a physical click inside my ribcage, a gear that had been jammed for 12 years finally snapping into place. The warmth of the submissive, perfect wife was gone, extinguished by a cold Arctic fire that felt like power. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my SUV with the doors locked, the briefcase on the passenger seat, watching the tree line through the rearview mirror. I realized then that Eleanor and Mark's greatest mistake wasn't the theft. It was the assumption that I was a creature of the city, a delicate flower that would wither without a climate-controlled penthouse. They forgot that I grew up with a grandfather who taught me how to read the weather and how to handle a shovel. By dawn, I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a strategist. I drove 2 towns over to a small, unassuming office with a sign that simply read, Miller and Associates, Criminal Law. Sarah Miller was a woman in her 60s, with silver hair and eyes like flint. She listened to my story for 3 hours, her pen scratching across a legal pad as she reviewed the documents I'd found. "They played a high-stakes game, Julia," Sarah said, leaning back and lighting a cigarette. "They used your name to build a firewall, but they forgot one thing. Once the firewall has the keys to the server, the architect is at its mercy. You own this land, you own the evidence, and because they used your trust to buy it, you have every right to invite whoever you want onto the property, including the IRS Criminal Investigation Division." The transformation was complete. For the next week, I worked like a woman possessed. I didn't go back to the city. I stayed in a local motel, working with Sarah and a contact she had in federal law enforcement. We mapped out the web of EM real estate, tracing the consulting fees back to the developers Mark was supposedly advising. The retribution was a dish served in the very mud they had tried to bury me in. I called Mark. My voice was trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of suppressed rage. I told him I was ready to talk. I told him I was scared, that the house was haunted by the smells, and that I just wanted to sign everything over to Eleanor and go away. I invited them to the house on Friday at sunset to finalize the transfer. When the black sedan pulled up the gravel path, I was standing on the porch. I had cleaned the front room just enough to look lived in. A single lamp flickered on the folding chair. Eleanor stepped out, looking triumphant in a white trench coat that cost more than the car I was driving. Mark followed, looking relieved. He actually had the audacity to smile at me, a pitying, there smile. "I knew you'd see reason, Julia," Mark said as they stepped onto the porch. "It's for the best, for everyone." He held out a thick stack of papers. "Just sign these. It transfers the property back to the holding company. We'll make sure you have enough to get a nice apartment in a different city, somewhere you can start over." I took the papers, looking at the signature line. "And the nursery in the penthouse, Mark? Is that for the best, too?" Mark's smile faltered. He looked at Eleanor, who sighed with theatrical impatience. "Don't be tedious, Julia. Sign the documents." I looked at her, my gaze steady and freezing. "I'm not signing anything, Eleanor. In fact, I've decided to do some renovations. I started by inviting some friends over to look at the foundations." "What are you talking about?" Eleanor snapped. "I'm talking about the federal agents in the woods," I said, "and the microphones I've been wearing since you got out of the car. You see, this house is a ruin, but the paper trail you left inside is a masterpiece of self-incrimination." The color drained from Mark's face. He turned toward the trees just as 3 black SUVs roared up the path, their sirens silent, but their lights flashing blue and red. "You bitch!" Eleanor hissed, her face contorting into something truly demonic. She lunged for the briefcase I had set on the porch railing, but I stepped in front of her. "Careful, Eleanor," I said, my voice as sharp as a razor. "That white coat will never get the blood out if you trip on these rotten boards. And honestly, this house was always a little too rustic for you anyway." Mark didn't even try to run. He just collapsed onto the porch steps, burying his head in his hands. He didn't say a word as the agents approached. He didn't defend his mother, and he didn't look at me. He was exactly what I had finally realized he was, a coward who hid behind women's skirts and bank accounts. The legal fallout was a landslide. Because the house was the physical hub of the operation, the feds seized everything. Mark and Eleanor's assets were frozen within 48 hours. The penthouse, the cars, the offshore accounts, all of it was tied to the laundering ring I had exposed. Sterling, the family lawyer, was disbarred and indicted within the month. Because I had been the whistleblower and could prove my signature was forged on the initial laundering documents, I was granted immunity. More than that, the court ordered a clawback of my grandfather's trust from the seized assets. I didn't just get my inheritance back, I got it back with interest. 6 months later, the air in the woods smells different. It doesn't smell like decay anymore. It smells like pine needles and fresh-cut cedar. I'm sitting on the porch of the cottage, which is no longer a ruin. The roof is new, the stone has been power-washed to a beautiful warm gray, and the swamp has been drained to reveal a stunning natural spring-fed pond. I've spent the last few months doing what I do best, landscaping. I've planted thousands of perennials that will bloom in the spring, a sea of color that will bury the memory of the winter. Mark is serving 5 years in a minimum security facility. Eleanor is fighting a losing battle against racketeering charges, her old money reputation shattered beyond repair. They lost the penthouse, the heir's nursery, and each other. I take a sip of my coffee, the steam curling into the crisp morning air. My life isn't curated anymore. It's wild, it's quiet, and it's entirely mine. I look out at the trees and realize that my grandfather's money didn't just buy me a house, it bought me the truth. I used to think that betrayal was the end of a story. Now I know it's just the clearing of the land before you start to build something that can actually weather the storm. You can bury the truth under 1,000 tons of rot, but the earth always finds a way to push it back to the light.